Ask the people who never used a chainsaw before. They'll tell you, you're in control.
Leatherface is one of pop culture's most misunderstood icons. People usually write him off as some psycho hillbilly who hates hot young people in Texas, but he's much more. He's not just a slasher villain, he and his whole messed up family are like this cracked reflection of America. The kind of America that has been lied to for generations by the people in charge, taught to blame the wrong folks every single time. When you look at it that way, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies aren't just gross out gore fests. They're actually super political. Each version of the story, whether it's from 1974, 1986, 2003, or 2022, is basically holding up a mirror to whatever political mess America was in at the time. Nixon, Reagan, Bush, Trump. Leatherface is what happens when that anger gets misdirected. Every time the country goes through some kind of economic collapse, war, or social chaos, Leatherface comes back swinging, and somehow the people who created the mess never end up on the chopping block. 1974, the death of the American dream. Okay, before you roll your eyes and think I'm reading too much into this, I'm not making it up. The creators literally said this movie was political. Tobe Hooper, who directed it, called it a black comedy inspired by what was going on during the Watergate scandal. And Kim Henkel, who co-wrote it, straight up said it was a response to the, quote, moral schizophrenia of the time. And I know you're asking yourself, what the hell was Watergate? Great question.
Watergate. The White House called it a third-rate burglary, but it escalated into the worst political scandal in American history. President Richard Nixon, only months after landslide re-election, finds himself haunted by a question that will not go away.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
So Watergate was this massive political scandal in the early 70s. Basically, some dudes broke into the Democratic Party's office at the Watergate building in DC, trying to steal information and plant bugs to spy on Nixon's political opponents. But they got caught. They were arrested, and investigators started looking into who was behind the break-in. Lo and behold, the break-in was tied to Nixon's re-election campaign. People in his administration tried to cover it up by lying and destroying evidence, but it wasn't enough. Journalists, government investigators, and whistleblowers uncovered the truth. Nixon's team had been involved in dirty tricks like spying on opponents and using illegal methods to stay in power, while secret recordings from the White House proved that Nixon himself had helped blend the cover-up. Eventually, it all came crashing down, and Nixon had to resign in 1974 before he got impeached. First president to ever do that. So when Kim Henkel talks about moral schizophrenia, he's talking about how trust in the government was absolutely wrecked. People felt like the whole system was corrupt. That's where the Sawyer family was born. They're like the broken, rotten version of the American family. They represent a broken version of traditional institutions like family, work, and survival, suggesting that the rot at the top of society had filtered down. To add to this disillusionment, there was the Vietnam War. Technically, the war ended in 75, but by the early 70s, most Americans already knew that it was a disaster. Many of the soldiers who died were working-class men, often poor, rural, and young. The war dragged on for years, and the fact that it was the first truly televised war meant an entire generation had access to the horrors of war in their living rooms every night. Images of combat, burning villages, body bags, and crying civilians were broadcast without delay, leading people to stop believing the government's discourse. That was different from World War II, for example, where people did see the newsreels, but only in movie theaters, and they were heavily censored and patriotic, showing only the victories and the heroism. By contrast, Vietnam footage often looked chaotic, brutal, and unwinnable, which translated into the grim and gory nature of the first Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So let's keep adding to the shit show. In 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, the OAPEC, stopped selling oil to the U.S. in response to the U.S.'s support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War, where Egypt and Syria tried to recover territories they had lost to Israel. This caused a massive gas shortage, which led people to panic. There were long lines at gas stations, fuel became super expensive and hard to find, jobs were affected, and it hit rural areas the hardest. Although some argue that in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the group of friends getting stuck because they ran out of gas was just a plot point, given that the oil embargo happened months after the film shoot took place, It was a plot point that also contextualized what life felt like at the time. On top of all that, one of the most common interpretations is that the Sawyer family is a representation of industrial capitalism, which became outdated with a shift to a post-Fordist economy. Post-Fordism refers to a new economic system that emerged in the 70s, emphasizing flexible production methods and a greater focus on service industries and technology, moving away from traditional mass production. The movie shows the Sawyer family as people who've been chewed up and spit out by big economic shifts. These were folks who knew how to work with their hands, chainsaws, hammers, all that, but suddenly their skills didn't matter anymore. With small rural slaughterhouses being replaced by larger automated urban facilities, towns built around those economies were being left behind. So the Sawyer's descent into cannibalism parallels the death of the meat economy, the working class feeding on itself. It's on that background that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was born. One where no one trusted the government, the military, or the media. One where the American dream started to feel like a scam. One where people, especially those in rural or poor communities, felt abandoned and angry. Nixon was a key part of that. His administration saw the end of the gold standard with rising inflation and wage stagnation, the beginning of deindustrialization, a law and order campaign that ignored rural decay, and an appeal to the silent majority of conservative, white, working-class Americans, all while abandoning their economic stability. He promoted traditional values but shifted power away from labor and into corporations, and pulled back social supports. And, a lot like in today's scenario, Nixon blamed the problems him and his goons caused on scapegoats like black people, for example. His Southern strategy deliberately capitalized on white backlash to civil rights advances, especially in the South. He used phrases like law and order, silent majority, and states' rights, which were all dog whistles that showed resistance to racial integration and protest. He framed civil rights activists as disruptive, un-American, or dangerous, rather than as citizens demanding justice. So there was a lot of blame shifting, which perfectly encapsulates how Leatherface was born, a poor, rural man in a lawless and broken country who was left to rot and made to think the reason for all his problems lied in progressive policies, represented by Sally and her friends. Conservatives like Nixon created Leatherface, not just through policies, but by ensuring that the rage and despair he embodies were never allowed to aim up, only sideways. 1986. Capitalism goes Hollywood. It took Tobe Hooper 12 years to deliver the sequel to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I personally think it was worth the wait. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 doubled down on the dark humor of the original one, giving us one of the most fun and political slashers to exist. It is set in the world of Reaganomics, where deregulation and consumerism were all the rage. In TCM 2, the Sawyer family has moved to northern Texas and operates a food truck, using the remains of missing and murdered people as ingredients. This setup is a commentary on the cycle of trickle-down economics, which is an economic theory that suggests that if the government gives benefits like tax cuts or subsidies to the wealthy and big businesses, that money will eventually trickle down to everyone else, benefiting the entire economy. The idea is that when the rich have more money, they will invest it, create jobs, and spend more, which will boost economic growth and benefit everyone. The concept of trickle-down economics became particularly prominent during the 1980s, especially in the United States under the Reagan administration. President Ronald Reagan and his economic advisors advocated for policies based on this theory, believing that reducing taxes on the wealthy and big businesses would stimulate economic growth that would eventually benefit everyone. This period saw significant tax cuts for the wealthy and deregulation of industries, which were thought to promote investment and job creation. Obviously, that's not the case, right? And critics argue that the implementation of trickle-down economics in the 1980s led to, you guessed it, increased economic inequality and did not result in the widespread benefits that were promised. Instead of trickling down, the money often stayed at the top, benefiting the wealthy few but not necessarily reaching the broader population. The rich became richer, while the middle and lower classes saw slower wage growth and fewer economic opportunities. In this context, the Sawyer family's food truck business reflects this idea of wealth staying at the top. They're not only literally feeding off the victims, but they represent how the wealthy can profit at the expense of others without benefiting society as a whole. The cook's success and complaints about property taxes illustrate this concept, showing how those at the top can benefit from the system while others suffer. Unlike TCM1, where they killed out of necessity, they now actively seek victims to get richer, to increase their capital. This shift reflects the entrepreneurial spirit of the Reagan and Thatcher era, era where individual success was emphasized over societal well-being. Under Reaganomics, it's not about surviving hardship, it's about thriving by exploiting it. The Sawyers learned to play the game and win, no matter the cost. Also, Reagan loved deregulating stuff. Industries, finance, telecommunications, transportations, you name it, he deregulated. That in itself created new markets and products catered to individual preferences. But one specific thing, the deregulation of advertising, led to a boom in targeted marketing. We're talking about the golden age of television, so the goal was not only to sell products, but sell lifestyles. Consumerism then became about expressing who you are rather than just buying out of necessity. Products became extensions of your identity. That, alongside with the suburban dream of a private yard and car, separating the self from the community, can be seen in the Sawyers' move from a decrepit farmhouse to an amusement park, a display of their newfound economic status. This access can also be seen in the specifics of the film itself. With a bigger budget, it had to meet the expectations of a 1980 sequel, which included longer running time, elaborate sets, a more complicated plot, and significantly increased gore. It reflected a trend in horror films of the 1980s where, after the success of the empty and elaborate kills that came out of films like Friday the 13th franchise, sequels often escalated the gore and shock value compared to the predecessors. Leatherface is, again, a reflection of the times. If in the original he was portrayed as an unthinking brute shaped by the socioeconomic circumstances of the times, in the second one he runs around like a confused teenager with a chainsaw, going through the woes of getting into contact with his sexuality for the first time and becoming oddly sympathetic in the process. The 80s were a time full of moral panic around sexuality, violence, and family values, all while also being a time of excess and indulgence like consumerism, Wall Street, MTV, slasher films, and the corn explosion. With that, Leatherface becomes like a conflicted child, repressed like the culture around him, but also a hyper-stimulated, over-the-top, pleasure-driven villain created as a product of Reagan's America. 2003. The militarization of fear. Holy shit, I love this movie. This was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre I grew up with. The opening sequence with the woman unaliving herself in the car traumatized me for years, good times. I think this movie is one of the first big showcases of post 9/11 horror, which brought us the likes of the torture porn subgenre and the wave of slasher remakes in the 2000s. Following the Patriot Act, which was planned to strengthen national security, particularly regarding foreign terrorism, they expanded surveillance abilities, including the tapping of phones, which made interagency communication easier, increased penalties for terrorism crimes, and expanded what was qualified as terrorism. Needless to say, the act was very, very controversial, and it created a climate of fear and paranoia where anyone could be a threat and the authorities couldn't be trusted. Speaking of authorities that couldn't be trusted, after 9/11, the US government decided to invade Iraq under the false pretense that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. That fear-driven decision spoke to a culture that believed we had to attack before getting attacked. Violence became a rational response to fear, and brutality could be justified if you felt threatened. That could also be seen in the rise of right-wing militias and survivalist culture. Government distrust had skyrocketed, especially in rural areas, so people began arming themselves, preparing for collapse, and rejecting mainstream systems. Survivalist culture became a lifestyle that bled into popular culture, especially horror. Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2003, being the first of its kind, showed that intensely. The movie brings us a new family, the Hewitts, who operate like a paramilitary unit with a clear hierarchy. They live off the grid in a town where there is no functioning police force, only a corrupt, violent figure of authority. After 9/11, there was this constant threat of danger and that the enemy was among us. This weaponized fear made people more open to accepting authoritarian responses, such as surveillance, war, racial profiling, and erosion of civil liberties, all in the name of safety. That also led to the dehumanization of outsiders and how people who were seen as different were also seen as dangerous. This movie is grim, y'all. It's violent, hopeless, and unrelentingly brutal. The protagonists aren't just killed, they're watched, stalked, hunted, and quite literally stripped of identity, since Leatherface takes a guy's face and wears it. There's no room for empathy, only raw survival, echoing how the Bush years turned suspicion into a national identity. I also tie this movie to the inception of the torture porn genre, a lot more than Saw and Hostel, honestly. It's no coincidence that the subgenre flourished in a time where remakes of 70s and 80s horror films were being made, given that it carries that splatter heritage. I think it's only logical that TCM 2003 is seen as the inception of the subgenre as we know it, and its context makes a lot of sense in that matter. I think it directly reflected real-world anxieties, moral crises, and the desensitization to violence in the wake of events like Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and the broader war on terror. The term torture porn, like the real one, was coined to describe horror films that focus intensely on physical suffering, body mutilation, and captivity, like Saw, Hostel, Wolf Creek, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2003. These films usually have the protagonist trapped in brutal, inescapable scenarios where survival depends on enduring unimaginable pain or moral compromise. I already told you that post 9/11, the US entered this hyper-paranoid state where violence was both fear and justified, right? So the media was flooded with images of violence, the burning towers, bodies, beheadings by terrorists, and with the advent of the internet, photos of torture inflicted by Americans. In 2004, photos emerged from the Abu Ghraib prison showing US soldiers abusing and humiliating detainees. Detainees in Guantanamo Bay were held indefinitely, often without trial, and subjected to torture euphemized as enhanced interrogation. These revelations shattered moral authority, especially around the myth that America stood for freedom and justice. Suddenly, Americans were the monsters in the basement. So I think the popularity of torture porn films came with both the exposure to violence, the moral questions that arose from that violence, and a sense of control in the middle of it all. It's like the true crime phenomenon where women are the biggest victims of violent crime, but also the biggest consumers of true crime content. It's like we feel that there is a morbid sense of control we gain when watching true crime content, like a continuation of instincts we were taught since a young age to protect ourselves, always be vigilant, and to learn how to survive. I think a lot of the fascination people had with torture porn at the time, and even today still, comes from this morbid need to know how the characters reacted in certain situations and how we can learn from their mistakes, because you never know. This overt violence brought a mirror to the helplessness of people caught in war zones and black sites and made us question the morality of torturers who were just, quote, doing their jobs. How much American fear was necessary to justify that level of torture, you know? That's why I see Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2003 as torture porn's ground zero. It's grim, grainy, and brutally physical, and it felt like a shift from suspense to sensation. The aesthetic is cold, wet, metallic, like a prison or interrogation chamber. In this environment, Leatherface became a weapon. If in 1974 he was a product of poverty and in 1986 he was a confused symbol of commodified violence, in 2003 he's a weapon forged by fear, survivalism, and authoritarian logic. Leatherface was stripped of any humanity or personal agency and followed orders like a soldier in a chain of command. He reflected the early 2000s mindset, loyalty and obedience over morality. Much like how the Bush-era rhetoric glorified discipline and toughness, Leatherface is a perfect enforcer, unfeeling, unquestioning, brutally efficient. His skin disease and disability are used to frame him as monstrous, but rather than explore that pain, the film uses it to justify his violence. The conservative post-9/11 era often used the fear of the other, the outsider, the sick, the foreign, the mentally unstable as a scapegoat for social problems. Leatherface became a caricature of fear, not a tragic figure, but a living embodiment of the threat everyone was told to be afraid of. His use of industrial tools is exaggerated to feel more tactical. His movements are deliberate, his skills are clean and brutal, like a trained executioner. He resembles a black ops enforcer, not a chaotic madman. This mirrors how the Bush administration blurred the lines between civilian and military force, using fear to justify extreme measures. Leatherface in 2003 is what happens when trauma is weaponized, trust is extinct, and survival becomes ideology. In a nation obsessed with identifying threats and neutralizing them by any means, he becomes the ultimate instrument of fear, a monster not born but made. 2022, The Ghost of American Collapse. I really like this movie, okay? Sue me. I did hate it when it first came out because other than the kills, I thought it was a bullshit plot with bullshit characters. But then I watched it over and over and thought about it over and over, and now I'm a defender. Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022 takes place 45 years after the original, and it's supposed to take place sometime after the other films. This franchise manages to be more convoluted than Halloween, and that's saying something. All I know is that 45 years after Sally Hardesty first escaped Leatherface, she's back to take revenge, or whatever. And she's accompanied by probably the most insufferable group of protagonists in a slasher film ever. Holy shit. and I was hoping they died, and die they did. So the backdrop for the film was post-2016 division, the post-Trump division. The country was very clearly divided between young liberals and the old school, old guard conservatives who wanted to maintain the status quo, whatever. Or at least that's the aesthetic of it, right? So the movie is basically a satire of this division and how I think young audiences today, the audiences that would be led to identify with the main group of protagonists, but they would have the thought process I did, which is these people are insufferable. I cannot believe, like, I hope my friends and I don't behave like this because these people are absolutely insufferable. And also, how nothing is clear cut. There's no straight answers in this world, right? This film was directed by David Blue Garcia, but it was produced by Fede Alvarez from Don't Breathe and Evil Dead fame. And one really clear theme he brings into Don't Breathe that I think makes itself really clear in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022 is that we live in a morally gray world. And this movie is morally gray. No character is right, no character is wrong, no character is sympathetic, no character has all the right answers. Everybody's just trying to figure out what's best. So we have this group of liberals pull up to the rural area of Harlow, Texas, and they buy the city from a bank to revitalize it and, you know, make it a safe space. It's kind of an oasis in the middle of the countryside where people can do art and be safe from the crazy outside world. They think they are exempt from inflicting violence on other people, that they are better than that. They think violence comes with old school thoughts and non-liberal points of view, which a lot of times it does, but that doesn't mean that just because you are more progressive in certain thinking processes and certain beliefs, it doesn't mean you are perfect. You are not exempt from making mistakes. Once I read this movie as satire of this surface level progress that liberals do, where it completely ignores the history and the people who lived there before, gentrifying a place, it becomes a really good movie. Once you realize you are a spectator of this scenario, of this situation, you don't have to personally identify with one character or the other, it becomes a much better experience. The other characters are this seemingly conservative white guy who drives a truck, and he's the manager of the town. He's a mechanic who lives there still, and he's the one welcoming the liberals. He thinks they're cultists because of the way they behave, because they see this town as a utopian answer to the violence of the big city. And besides this guy, we have Leatherface living in an orphanage with Ginny. So there's this new character, Ginny. I love her. She's an old woman who lives in the town and claims that she owns her house. She owns the orphanage and her house, and the liberals claim she doesn't, that they bought everything. And they end up finding the certificate that says Ginny actually owns the house, and they don't find the certificate that said that they bought her house. So she owns the house and she has the right to stay in her house. But they come from this perspective of these people are backwards, they don't really understand anything, they're not civilized or whatever, and we know better. So because we know better, we get to say if they get to stay or not. Ginny wasn't very aesthetic for the liberals. She was an old woman who had this weird guy living with her, which is Leatherface, and her orphanage has a Confederate flag outside of it. So, and the whole thing starts because they try to remove the Confederate flag, and she's like, oh no, it's been there since my grandpa's time, whatever. It's not like she carries the prejudices her grandpa carried, but it's a symbol of a town that's always been there. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about Ginny as a person or about anybody that they judge at face value. Nothing that they judge turns out to be true, except for Leatherface. But Leatherface in this scenario becomes more of a rejection of this modern liberal fantasy, this utopia. His rampage isn't just personal, but it's symbolic of rural rage against the erasure of old identities and grievances. And I think it speaks, especially, this movie came out in 2022, so it was during the Biden administration, but the 2020 elections made it clear, and I think the 2024 elections made it extremely clear, that the Democrats don't speak to the people. They speak to the aesthetics. They speak to the idea of being seen as the good people, as a lesser evil, and as the ones you should vote for if you're not a racist or a bigot or whatever. But people are hungry. People are poor. People are broke. They don't have healthcare. They don't have access to higher education. People are in debt. And once you don't have the basics, money, safety, people are feeling unsafe. People are starving. Once you don't have the basics of what you need to be a functional human being, you don't care about ideologies and the position that the president has on certain groups of people. As long as minorities get to become scapegoats of these basic problems, the public's gonna back whichever government says, I can fix your problems. And I think the biggest problem with the Democratic Party is that they don't seem to want to fix the problems. They want to seem like the better aesthetic option. So continuing the story, the liberals kick Ginny out of her home, claiming she doesn't own it, whatever, gentrifying the fuck out of Harlow. And she feels ill, and the police takes her to the hospital. And on the way to the hospital, Ginny dies. I think she has a heart attack and dies, and Leatherface is with her. And so his rampage starts as something personal, like they took away the only person that cared about him. But once he goes back to Harlow, it becomes something systemic. And it's like, okay, it doesn't doesn't have a right to kill people, but I kinda get it. These people gentrified a city and killed a woman in the process of trying to make things seem more appealing, more aesthetic to the investors that are coming into Harlow to buy into Harlow and to make it into this utopian place. And the problem is these unaddressed grievances. They didn't care to talk to Ginny. They cared about the aesthetics of what she represented. They could have talked to her to just remove the flag and then give it back to her later, explain the situation, but they didn't see her as a person. They saw her as an element, an unpleasant element of this new utopian place they wanted to build. I really love Leatherface, truly, deeply. Over the years, I've developed a kind of emotional connection to him across different iterations. I have my favorites. I have a soft spot for the 1986 Leatherface. He's cute, he's strangely sweet and oddly endearing in his brutal way. I also love the 2003 version, not necessarily because of what he represents, but because I'm drawn to survivalist versions of iconic slashers. Survivalist Jason, for example, basically my fictional boyfriend. There's something about that hardened, stripped down version of the killer archetype that I find compelling. That said, 2022's Leatherface feels like something altogether different. He's not just a killer, he's a manifestation. He represents the festering, unresolved rot at the heart of a nation that tried to bury its sins instead of healing them. He's the violent, guttural response to decades of avoidance. He's what erupts when the system's cracks go unaddressed for too long, when aesthetics are chosen over justice, when people care more about optics than about fixing the foundation. What makes this Leatherface unique is that he is not killing for meat, family, or even tradition. He's not a stand-in for commodified violence or southern grotesquerie. He's killing for memory, for revenge, because there is nothing left for him but the past. He's an old man with nothing to lose, and what's chilling is that he hasn't evolved, he's just been waiting. The film makes it clear, symbolic gestures won't protect you from real systemic violence. There is a moment on the party bus where a character, phone in hand, tries to cancel Leatherface before a killing spree. It's such a clear satire of the hollow performance of digital activism. Hashtags can stop a chainsaw. The film hammers in that message that branding mindfulness or wokeness as safety is delusional in the face of unresolved cultural decay. You cannot put perfume on a rotting corpse and expect the rot to go away. The same goes for the country. Without addressing the core societal wounds, the violence never really ends. It just festers. Even Melody and Dante, urban food entrepreneurs who see themselves as progressive outsiders, somehow above the rural world they enter, are echoes of the past they believe they've outgrown. They view themselves as part of a new elevated culinary class, modern and sophisticated. But in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, the Sawyer family ran a food truck too. The parallel is striking. Both are cooks, both commodify flesh, but both believe they're feeding people something better. The difference is only aesthetic. The horror is that history repeats and no one notices until it's too late. Something else I really love is the way TCM 2022 incorporated Sally. I can't tell how much I first hated that they brought her back just to kill her off like she was nothing. But that's probably one of my favorite things about this movie. I hate legacy characters. I can't stand them. Not the characters themselves, just how they represent the cheap, uninspired ways studios found to cash in on the nostalgia of much better films, but that's a topic for another video. Ever since Laurie Strode came back in 2018, there's been this trend of revisiting classic films with a focus on trauma and long-term character arcs, which can be great. Following a character for years can make us feel like part of their world. But what really frustrates me is when creators forget the actual story and just throw in fan service. Instead of growing the characters or taking this story somewhere new, it becomes a checklist of callbacks. It limits the creativity, makes things feel safe and predictable, and ends up relying on nostalgia instead of doing something bold and fresh. That's actually why I really love the way Sally comes back in this movie. More than anything, I feel like she's a perfect reflection of how obsessed we are with nostalgia and how hard it is for both audiences and studios to let go of familiar IP. In a lot of ways, she's clearly meant to echo Laurie from Halloween 2018, the terrified final girl turned hardened survivalist, clinging to the trauma that defined her, waiting decades for the chance to finally face the men who broke her. But Texas Chainsaw Massacre doesn't give her the same kind of closure Laurie got. There is no big emotional payoff. Instead, the movie brushes her aside, barely acknowledges her pain, and literally chainsaws through her legacy. It's brutal and kind of brilliant because it makes a point. Clinging to the past doesn't protect you and nostalgia won't save you. In the end, Leatherface doesn't even remember her. He doesn't care. To him, her friends were meat on a plate 50 years ago. She's not some meaningful figure from his past. She's just another stray animal that slipped through the fence. Something to kill, something to forget. I love it. I love him, and I think you should watch this movie. Leatherfaces are born in every era where conservative policies destabilize the working class and misdirect their rage. There have been many versions of him over the years, but I chose to focus on these 4 iterations specifically because they carry a clear political and cultural weight. Films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, 4, 2006, Texas Chainsaw 3D, and Leatherface lean more into the horror for horror's sake. They don't carry the same ideological or historical torch that the original and the versions I've highlighted do, so they feel less relevant to this particular conversation. Leatherface as a character might be the slasher villain most inherently tied to politics, not in the sense of partisan engagement, but in how clearly he reflects political, economic, and cultural shifts. He becomes a kind of barometer for the state of the nation. In every major iteration, he's not just a killer, he's a symptom. He doesn't just haunt individuals, he haunts eras. He's not just horror, he's history. And history, as we know, tends to repeat itself, which makes me wonder, in the wake of another Trump administration and in this increasingly volatile cultural moment, will we see an even more fascist version of Leatherface emerge? A continuation of the 2022 version, maybe? A Leatherface forged not from just personal trauma, but from collective decay? Because in the end, the real horror isn't the chainsaw. The real horror is a society that keeps building the same monster decade after decade.